InspirEd Virtual Learning Series. Welcome to InspirEd. As we continue to watch the COVID-19 pandemic evolve in Ohio, this school year looks different for everyone, and that is why InspirEd was created by the Ohio Department of Education's Office for Exceptional Children and OCALI. Each week, this virtual learning series brings you information and resources on a variety of topics to help support learning and successful outcomes for students. Whether you're an educator supporting students with disabilities, an administrator providing resources to educators, or a family member navigating your role during at-home learning, InspirEd is for you. The content of this webinar has been pre-recorded, but we want to encourage your participation. If you have any questions or comments, we invite you to be part of the discussion by using the chat feature. Questions will be answered throughout the webinar, and later we'll be providing a link in the chat to a brief survey. By completing a survey, you'll be able to access a certificate verifying your attendance in this webinar. During this very unique time of learning, connecting and exchanging ideas is a key to inspiring success. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Welcome to today's InspirEd, online instruction based on communication mode. From face-to-face to online or hybrid, school sure has taken many forms during this pandemic. Ensuring all learners have access to the curriculum has been essential, which starts with identifying each learner's preferred communication mode. Today, we will interview specialists in the field about how to identify learners' preferred communication mode and what that means for access. I am Christine Croyle, the Program Director at the Outreach Center for Deafness and Blindness, and I'll be your host today. Our panelists are Shauna Benson, the Program Director for the Teaching Diverse Learners Center at OCALI, Abby Weaver, Teacher of the Deaf and Consultant for the Outreach Center, Jessica Chandler, a teacher of students with visual impairments and a certified orientation and mobility instructor for Butler County ESC. So, let's get started. As we get started, I think it would be good to begin with an understanding of what we mean by communication mode. Abby, how would you define communication mode?
Communication comes in a wide variety of manners. Many of us think of spoken English right away, but for a deaf and hard of hearing students, they can use American Sign Language or other sign systems. So we also need to think about it's not always pick one. You can have a variety. So I may be speaking in English, but receptively, I may be watching my American Sign Language interpreter in the school environment. So receptive and expressive, it's not always going to match up. It's not always going to be the same. It could be, but you need to be ready for it to be a little bit different in that regard as well. You also need to think about being flexible with the environment. How one uses language on site at the school or in the virtual environment can be different as well. Jessica?
Thanks, Abby. So as you can see on the slide, we have a couple of language modes displayed in pictures. We have speaking and body language. We have a child there picking up a phone, a toy phone. We've got a picture of an object and tangible schedule. We have an I love you sign for sign language. Expressive behaviors, a little boy who's kind of making a face. We have a voice output switch with 3 different choices. A student might use that. We have pictures. A picture of a student reading Braille. And then we have a picture of icons where a student might communicate by choosing from the icons. And then lastly, we have a keyboard with a student that's typing text. Some of the challenges that remote learning presents is the need to be sure that accessible materials are in place at home in order for the student's environment to be pre-planned. For students with visual impairment, this means that the materials need to be brailled ahead of time and sent to the home. For visually impaired students who might also have multiple disabilities, this means that their object calendar and the pieces that go with it need to be set up at home. The United States Postal Service thankfully allows free matter for the blind to be sent to individuals who are blind and visually impaired free of charge. There are some requirements, but those requirements can be found in the resource page. Please be aware that some postal workers are unaware of the program, and you may need to be firm and/or provide some literature to assist them in processing your mailings.
Shauna, how would you define communication mode?
Well, oftentimes, if people are asked to define communication, many people would probably define communication in a very traditional manner by referencing verbal communication. But we have to acknowledge that communication is really expressed using many different modes, as Abby talked about earlier. The many modes of communication document that's shown here on this slide shows communication wheel with many different types of communication and a description of each type. Some of the communication modes on this document include things like body language, gestures, verbal language, and sign language. And most of us use many of these forms ourselves throughout every single day.
Now that we have an understanding of what we mean by communication mode, how do you discover the communication mode of your learners? Shauna, can you start us off?
Sure. Well, if we notice that a learner is struggling to be understood by those around them, or if a team is challenged to understand an individual, they may want to pursue a collaborative approach in developing a communication profile for an individual. The profile could include access information in the areas of sensory, motor, vision, hearing, as well as current communication attempts and different modes that the individual may be using. Tools such as the communication matrix can be used to document present communication skills as well as areas of need that the individual may be experiencing. Together with the access information, this data profile can help the team and learner acknowledge, look for, and use current communication skills that they have, as well as incrementally growing communication skills and access skills over time to improve expressive and receptive language acquisition. There is a link to the communication discovery process that includes the communication matrix in a toolkit that's provided in our resources from the session today.
One thing that you should also look at is what's the child doing naturally in the environment when they're interacting with you as an adult, but also their peers. You want to kind of look at child to adult, and that can be community adults, but also teachers, because this can be a little bit different between someone in the hallway versus someone being more formal in instruction mode. But then again, how are they interacting with peers, their age, younger or older? But also, which requires significant effort for the child, which is easier for them. They may have two different communication approaches that they prefer for informal conversations, and then another communication approach that they prefer for the more formal, for the academic environment, where they may need different supports. And sometimes we even have students that maybe call it a passive bilingual, where they may be watching the interpreter and using that information receptively, but you may not see them signing very often. But the sign language and the interpreter is still very critical in their learning. Just because they can talk to you informally in the hallway doesn't mean that they can access the information fully, auditory skills alone. They still need that sign language interpreter and American Sign Language as that bridge. You also want to take a close look at the communication planning guide and take a look at that, because that will look at different aspects, such as I mentioned, how does the child communicate with the teacher, their peers, their family, the people on the IEP team, and also keep in mind, how are they communicating on site? And with the recent change in education, how are they communicating in the virtual environment? Because that's going to be very different, as they may have not needed different supports in the classroom, but now you find that they need captions in the virtual environment. You also want to be mindful for the digital environment. When you're listening to a digital signal, and then your hearing aid or your cochlear implant is another digital signal, it's almost a copy of a copy. So each time you get removed from the original source, it can be harder to process that information auditorily. And then for the students that are using visual language, you want to make sure that the sign language is coming through clearly without pixelation or delays in the video feed.
Thank you, Abby. Jessica.
In the area of low vision and blindness, there's a referral or assessment process called a learning media assessment. And this assessment determines which learning media is most appropriate for the student. So many times this might mean regular print, enlarged print, large print, braille, or auditory. And then it can even be a combination of any of those. In addition, it could be objects or symbols. And once this is determined, instruction should be provided using that appropriate medium.
Thank you, Jessica. Can you tell us a little bit more about that learning media assessment you mentioned?
Sure. The learning media assessment is not only a decision tool, but it's also a monitoring tool. In fact, every year at the IEP meeting, this is visited for a student with a visual impairment through Section 16 on the IEP, which is not populated unless the student has a visual impairment. At that time, that is reviewed. You can think of a learning media assessment in 3 parts. It's the initial selection, confirming that selection, and then monitoring the selection annually. And it can be fluid. Sometimes you don't know what will work or not work until you've given it a try. The learning media assessment should address both conventional literacy and functional literacy. Just think about a student that has some usable vision, but then also uses Braille. There's a place for low vision tools, for spot reading, or maybe even using technology for optical character recognition, especially at a grocery store or other places where Braille is not widely available. But incorporating low vision tools for this purpose should be a consideration as part of the process.
Thank you, Jessica. For those interested in learning more about a learning media assessment, the Outreach Center has a webinar coming up on January 27th at 1 o'clock. We hope you can join us. So with an understanding of what is a communication mode, what are they, and tools to identify what they are, let's now take a look at how we can support learners with support and the things we need to consider when providing instruction in an online environment. We have a chart that shows the communication modes in the left column, supports in the middle column, and considerations in the right column. Shauna, can you get us started by sharing?
Sure. One of the things that we would want to do is to offer flexible use of language during learning and assessment, both online and in face-to-face learning opportunities. So just making sure that students can use any mode of communication that is most effective in the setting in which they're in, and using those preferred tools as well. Teachers can plan for flexibility in language by acknowledging nonverbal communication when learners are using it, and also offering multi-sensory approaches to teaching and learning that can open the doors for participation and access. Peers can also be leveraged as models for using symbol-based communication system and other core and fringe vocabulary systems during communication exchanges with peers. We need to also remember that wait time should be practiced by both educators and peers to allow learners processing time and motor planning time during communication opportunities. Planning for the integration of assistive communication technologies, both low and high tech, is really a critical part of the pre-planning process for any lesson and any assessment.
Thank you, Shauna. Jessica, can you share the supports for our learners who are blind visually impaired?
Sure. I have some learners that might use objects or tangible symbols. And so one of the most important things is to make sure that the system at home is similar to that in which the student is familiar with at school. So using the same symbols like a timer for independent work for activities that occur in both places will assist with the student's ability to transfer their knowledge across those settings. Helping parents to establish new symbols for activities that only occur in the home will also assure that the student has appropriate symbols for activities and that the object calendar is expanded into routines throughout the day. Moving on to large print or braille or auditory, pre-planning the environment requires materials be sent prior to the lesson and sometimes vice versa, or sent from the student back to the teacher. This can be via the United States Postal Service with the free matter for the blind, or utilizing some technology. So you could take a screenshot and read the teacher of the visually impaired could read the read the Braille with their vision. Or there's some screen sharing opportunities, and even a new website called ABC Braille that can take Braille and put print underneath it so that you can see the print and the Braille if you're not a Braille reader. So setting up to monitor both Braille reading and writing can be achieved rather easily with the right tools. I found if you can prop the phone up using either a holder or some other device, connecting with an iPod or iPhone, that can even be Velcroed to that workstation so that you have that optimal view and the student doesn't have to mess with it each time. And it's just provides a more ease of access. Let's see. This will also allow the provider to see what the student is working on as they read the Braille materials or write on a Braille writing device or even a keyboard. I also take into consideration how much time is needed for the arrival of materials to the student. So if I'm mailing using the United States Postal Service, I found that sometimes it can take less than 24 hours, and at other times it could take more than a week. So sometimes porch drop-offs or drop-offs at a location like the school for parent pickup needs to be considered.
Thank you, Jessica. Abby, can you share a little bit about the communication supports and considerations for our learners who are deaf and hard of hearing?
For our deaf and hard of hearing students, we need to be mindful of audio quality. They may be listening through hearing aids or cochlear implants, or their interpreter may be listening. The interpreter needs to have quality audio for them to interpret accurately. So regardless of who's listening or how they're listening, audio quality is the number one thing you need to think about. If the audio quality is poor, someone that has compromised hearing or diminished hearing is going to be struggling to begin with. And then when you have poor quality, it just makes that learning that much more not effective, where they may check out. Then you want to also think about the visual quality. If the interpreter is pixelated or the teacher is pixelated, then the child is not able to access the sign language or the lip reading cues or facial cues to connect with their teacher or their peers. You also want to think about lighting. So right now I'm in an environment where it's well lit. I've got a solid shirt on, a black shirt, and I've got a high contrast between my hand and my shirt. So if I were interpreting or signing or working with a deaf and hard of hearing student, there's not a lot of visual distraction. They can attend to me as the teacher or the interpreter that's interpreting, depending on the situation. You also need to think about how is the interpreter going to interpret on site if the child's off site streaming in, or if the interpreter is off site interpreting. That requires different configuration. And also be mindful, you want to think about how are your sub-interpreters going to connect in the event that you need a sub-interpreter virtually for online learning. You also want to think about the fact is the child may need the interpreter for online learning that is considered pre-recorded or static or a hybrid or a flipped classroom. I've had some people say, oh, well, on Monday and Wednesday, they're just reading and doing independent work. They're meeting with their instructor on the other days. They don't need the interpreter. That's not the case. English may not be their first language, so they still need the interpreter to help access the curriculum or the material. Back to you, Christine.
Wow, so many things for us to think about. Thank you all. So now we have a good understanding of communication modes, how we identify learners' modes, supports to put in place, and things to consider. Now let's look at how we pull this all together with families. You'll see on the slide a family meeting with an educator to see how they can work together. Shauna, how could families and educators work together to support our learners' communication mode at home, at school, and in the community?
Well, Christine, I think one way to ensure that individuals are building communication skills and that they have access to tools and technology that they need is really about collaboration and communication. So I do think that families and educators definitely need to work together and really support the learner so that they're able to communicate and have all the access they need in all the settings that they're working in, including the virtual setting in this case. Sometimes families understand nuances and language that are used by individuals in the home and community. When family and the individual are kind of around one another, they become accustomed to tiny elements in language, maybe a blink or a head positioning, or even sometimes a specific gaze or a twitch maybe of an eyebrow or something of that nature that has very significant meaning in communication that other people may not necessarily notice. But the family definitely uses and notices those things as communicative intent, and definitely understands the meaning behind it. But not everybody would. So one of the things that we need to get better at, I think, between educators and families is communicating and sharing those little nuances in language with the educators that are working with the individual and the IEP team at large, so that the team can work together to build the skills and support independence for the individual, build off of those communication nuances into more generalized language even, so that the student can be understood by everyone, not just family members, and so that family members aren't tempted to kind of communicate for the learner when other people aren't understanding. We really need to work together to build all of those skills so that an individual can access all facets of communication, say anything they want to say at any time to anyone. And that takes definitely working together. And that's really the goal, is that we want the individual to be understood anywhere, and be able to engage in conversations anywhere with anyone that they would like. So I think that's maybe a foundation for this kind of collaboration, maybe between families and educators. Abby, do you have other ideas?
I do. The parents can be a critical link. You kind of want to connect with them and see what their technology skills are like as well. Don't overlook that, because it's easy to overlook that. And also know what technology is being used in the home. Sometimes I've had parents help me during a lesson where a student needed help just simply knowing how to cut and paste, right click versus left click. The challenges may not be disability related. It may be technology related or technology skills related, that your student hadn't had to acquire those skills yet in the virtual environment. So make sure you look at both. Is it a language issue, a technology issue, or a skills issue? You also want to think about how you can have them use different tools, such as speech to text or text to speech, or captions or automatic speech recognition captions. There's so much in the virtual environment that you don't want to overlook. So bottom line, communicating with your families, because with the assistive listening devices, they may have never needed to use certain features or programs or assistive technology in the home, such as a school microphone. They never needed to patch into the family computer. Bottom line is going to have to be open and ongoing communication, because what works one day may not work the next day.
Thank you, Abby. Jessica, can you share a little bit about how our families can work with educators to serve those who are blind or visually impaired?
Sure. Connecting with other providers who are also providing remote instruction to be sure that accessible materials make it to the student for their lessons has been key. If a speech and language pathologist has a lesson in mind that requires some braille materials, the teacher of the visually impaired has to help coordinate this so that the materials can get to them on time. Another consideration is the need for interlined or print copies to match any braille. So this would help any braille reader to follow along. And there's several ways to accomplish that. One way would be to use the ABC Braille site that we had talked about earlier. And another way is to talk to your braille transcriptionist. And there's a way to produce an interlined sim braille copy from the Duxbury program. And I've added that in the resource section for anybody that doesn't already know how to do that. Students with visual impairment might also need to have an object or tangible symbol system in the home. So helping parents to organize these symbols will encourage them to use the symbols through ease of access. I often suggest that hanging a shoe organizer to get these objects organized and quickly available helps to promote the use of the object calendar in the home.
Jessica, I love the creativity of the shoe organizer to help families and learners organize those object symbols. What I have heard from each of you is the importance of beginning with understanding and identifying communication modes, pre-planning to ensure each learner has access based on their communication mode, and ensuring that team members and families are working together so each learner has access in the online environment. That sounds like success to me. We have compiled a few resources on this slide to support you with accessibility in the online environment. In addition, we have compiled a handout with additional resources to support you as you identify and support learners in their communication modes. So we'd like to thank you for joining us today. On this slide is our contact information, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Christine Croyle is Christine_Croyle, CROYLE @OCALI.org. Shauna Benson, SHAWNA_BENSON @OCALI.org. Jessica Chandler JESSICA.CHANDLER @BCESC.org. And Abby Weaver, WEAVERABBEY170 @gmail.com.
Thanks for participating in today's webinar. We've provided a link in the chat to a brief survey, and we'll also follow up by email with the same link and additional information about this series. This series is for you, and we welcome any feedback. By completing the survey, you'll be able to access a certificate verifying your attendance in this webinar. This recording and related resources will be available on demand through our website, ocali.org. There, you'll also find upcoming and past episodes of InspirEd. And you can keep the conversation going on social media. Find us at OCALI Official on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and by using the hashtag InspirEdOhio. As we move forward together in virtual learning, our connections help to inspire success. InspirEd, Virtual Learning Series.